This is Nanny, and I'm doing a horoscope reading on Elizabeth Colpoys. Is that the way I pronounce it? Born April 26, 1949, at 4:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in Niagara Falls, New York. Today's date is the 27th of June of 1986. Now, if you ever wonder about it, the state of California was not on daylight savings time in '49, but most places on the East Coast were using it at that point. So if you ever wonder, that's what I found. I have a book that lists all of these things in it. At any rate, let me first of all explain to you what the chart represents astronomically, so that you may better relate to these symbols. This is a simplified map of the sky around you at the time in which you were born, and you can think of yourself as being born in a hospital dead center in the middle of the wheel there. All of the symbols which surround the center point represent the planets surrounding you at the time you were born. And this line, which runs across the chart horizontally, is called the horizon line, so that all of the symbols that you find above that line represent the planets above the horizon at that time. The symbols in the lower half, on the other hand, represent the planets below the horizon at that particular point. When we say you're a Taurus, we're saying at the time you were born, the sun fell in the sign of Taurus, as none of us are actually just one sign. In addition to the sun, for instance, being in Taurus, you also have the moon in Aries, as you're probably aware. And the rising sign, which is the sign on the eastern horizon that was rising or ascending when you were born, happened to be the sign of Virgo. Is that corresponding to what was given to you before? Or you don't remember?
My sun's sign was.
Okay.
I had forgotten.
Okay. The sun is like a hand on the clock, so if you're born in the middle of the afternoon, which is actually the case since daylight savings time extends things artificially an hour later than it really is, the sun will end up in this area of the chart normally, about halfway between the top of the chart, where it would be if you've been born at 12 noon, and sunset, which is over on the right side of the chart, which is representative of the western horizon point. This symbol here with the ears on it, the circle with the ears, is the sign of Taurus, and the number 6 is the 6th degree. The sun moves forward at the rate of 1 degree per day approximately. So you were born approximately the 6th day through the sign in which the sun was passing through the sign of Taurus. The moon in Aries was just preceding the sun. You were born just a little bit before the new moon. So in another day and a half it would have been right up there in Taurus with the sun, in other words. All of us are a mixture of signs, so in addition to the sun sign in Taurus and the moon in Aries, you do have other planets scattered around in various positions. In addition to this, however, there are also the numbered boxes 1 through 12 that are shaped like slices on a pie. And these are called the houses. And the houses are like different departments of life. There's a house of money, there's a house of work, there's a house of marriage. According to where we find the planets and the signs here, gives me information about the way you would be intended to approach these areas of life. In addition to that, the colored lines, yes, which do sometimes get omitted, especially if you get a computer printout. It's only recently the computers have started actually coloring in aspects, and not all of them do it yet by any means. So this is where a little manual work can come in handy. The aspects of the geometrical configurations in effect at the time you were born, and the way they mix together also gives important information about your character. The easiest one to understand is the conjunction, like the Sun and Venus here, marked by the yellow splotch on the outside ring there. The conjunction is 2 planets in the same position, operating as a unit, and the Sun-Venus mixture is a particularly nice one. In addition to this, however, you also have some other colored lines in the wheel. The more harmonious lines are the green and the blue lines. The green lines are called sextiles and show us planets that were 2 signs apart, like say Uranus and Gemini to Saturn and Leo is one example. The green lines called sextiles are somewhat weaker in power than the blue lines called trines, which are planets that were 4 signs apart. An example would be Mars in Aries to Saturn in Leo. But the Sun is very close to the end of Aries, so it ends up in a sort of weak trine to Saturn also. That is represented by the dashed blue line there. These aspects show us where things tend to flow more easily and naturally together, and they're more easily ignored. I don't always cover every one of them in the reading, actually, because it's the red and the purple lines that really make things happen. The red lines are called squares, and they indicate planets that were 3 signs apart at the time you were born. An example would be the Sun in Taurus to Jupiter in Aquarius, for instance. And the opposition, Moon in Aries to Neptune in Libra. 6 signs apart, opposite sides of the Earth when you were born. These aspects are called hard aspects. They make things happen. They instigate action in our lives, not always well-advised action, but they keep us moving and experimenting and trying new things until we correct things that need correcting in our lives, in other words. These aspects are always useful because if you didn't have them, you'd be a rather complacent individual. So most charts have a nice balance of the two here, the 2 types of forces here, we'll say. At any rate, there's only one other symbol that I haven't mentioned as far as categories are concerned, and that's these letters R that are placed here. Retrograde is what those stand for. Planets that were moving backwards in association to the Earth at the time you were born, and in this case it's only 2. Right now we have about 6 planets in retrograde. Well, we'll have 7 by the middle of July, which is an unusual number. At any rate, maybe we got 5 now, but anyway, we've got a lot right now. And retrogrades have a tendency to represent more sluggish energy in the chart. So what I'm going to be doing here first of all for you is I'm going to go over your natal chart, which this thing is that you're looking at. The natal chart is a somewhat timeless thing in that it shows us the potential that we have throughout our lives. It's a somewhat timeless thing, but it does not tend to operate in every corner 24 hours a day. Later on, though, I will get into some of the specific influences that I see for you here in the year ahead and beyond, and I will address those issues that you were particularly interested in, okay? First of all, you probably know something, and it does sound like you do indeed know something about your sun sign of Taurus, because most people find this is something that gets raised in casual conversation, even if they're not interested in astrology. The sun sign is important. It is sort of the prime energy source in the chart. It shows us where we need to shine in life and what we need to do to fulfill the ego. So if you have a sun in Taurus, it means you're intended to fulfill many of the better characteristics of the sign of Taurus. If you are a Taurus, one of the things that we say about this sign is that it tends to be a very durable sign. There's no sign of the zodiac that lives longer than a Taurus normally. There is something very solid about Tauruses that many people find very reassuring. And yet it's solid without being brittle, like a Capricorn can be. Capricorns can be kind of stuffy, but Tauruses have a tendency to drift more towards a socially friendly sort of solidity, you might say. That is, they're solid without seeming like stone, in a sense. You happen to be born with the conjunction of the Sun and Venus together, which means that no matter what sign you were born under, if you have that combination, it will make you a friendlier version of the sign, because Venus is the planet of love and affection. It has to do with youthful energy. If it is next to the Sun, it will allow you to remain attractive longer in your life and to exude a kind of friendliness that will cause you to be better liked than a lot of people. So this will be very helpful towards your being able to sell yourself in this life and having people respond to you the way that you want. Not only that, Venus itself has a lot of affinity with Taurus. It's what we call the ruling planet of Taurus. So when it gets involved with the Sun in Taurus, it accentuates the ability of a Taurus to be generally attractive anyway. Taurus is associated with certain types of themes. For one thing, it is an earth sign, And the earth signs are associated with a particular element of resourcefulness. That is, Tauruses handle well the various resources of the earth. We have many Tauruses who, for instance, choose to own a farm because they have a real affinity for the earth itself. There is something about Taurus that is very unashamedly kind of physical. They like the sensual side of existence here on earth. And they have a particular affinity for food normally. Not all of them will become chefs, but normally Tauruses enjoy food in a manner that we don't find with most of the rest of the signs. Tauruses, if they don't cook food, they will often grow it, because this is a sign that knows how to work with the earth to enrich it and make it work for them. But it also covers a whole wide range of subject matter too, because Tauruses also engage in the refinement of the raw materials that come out of the earth, so that furniture salesmen would be a classic example of a Taurus, knowing what people need in order to feel comfortable. Tauruses love comfortable things. It is not a sign normally suited for living in a motel-like environment. Instead, they like a lot of comfortable furniture, they like a lot of food, and it is basically a very sensual type of sign. Taurus is a sign that we also find usually has a very nice voice, because it is the throat that is ruled by the sign of Taurus. Bing Crosby is a good example of a Taurus. Very, very pleasant voice, used for commercial advantage, and certainly a very stubborn man at heart too, another Taurian characteristic. The fact is, Tauruses will find that their voices can be used very much to their advantage, but also some of the physical ailments they attract may also be linked to the throat more often. Taurus, of course, is like the bull itself. You cannot push a bull into the barn, you have to coax it, and this is the way to behave with Tauruses. Tauruses absolutely detest being hurried into things unless they feel it is their idea and their time to do what they're going to be doing. Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, is the sign of action, but Taurus is reaction and resistance. Taurus wants to argue about things that Aries wants to go ahead and do. So a Taurus will sometimes be embroiled every morning in some kind of minor argument, either within themselves or maybe with somebody else, over whether or not they want to pursue a particular line of operation. Because of this tendency to resist change, many Tauruses are noted for staying in things a long time, and therefore develop a real sense of reliability. But it is also true that many Tauruses sit around waiting for things to happen too, rather than trying to make something happen. Now, a way in which the argumentativeness is expressed in a somewhat humorous way would be the example of Don Rickles, who is also a Taurus. A lot of people think he's a rather vulgar man, but I have to admit he does take the Taurus argumentativeness and perhaps apply it in a more congenial way than some other expression that might have arisen if he was in some other country, where he probably would be arrested, I suppose. But he's also a good example of a Taurus physically. He's hardly what you'd call a featherweight. He's a very bulky, very solid-looking man. He's not somebody who's just going to fall over when you blow in his face. So that's something about Taurus that many people find extremely appealing. There's something about them physically that is all here. They don't look like someone who's a space case. They don't seem to have their minds off in some faraway place all the time. They're right here, right now. Some Tauruses become carpenters. That's another popular pastime, because there's something about Tauruses that do very well. They find it relaxing to do something that, again, is basically physical. Now, you have another sign in your chart that also has some basic physical characteristics, and that's your Virgo rising. Most Virgo rising people do have rather sensitive hands and work with their hands in a particularly effective way. So as at least a means of relaxation, your chart would seem to indicate that to at least have some kind of hobby related to some sort of handiwork would probably be useful for you. However, there's a whole other side of Taurus I haven't mentioned, and that is that Tauruses are very good with many financial matters too. Taurus people are the kinds of people who have a role in this world that is usually linked to helping to sustain the rest of us, in a sense, or to give people advice related to achieving a state of permanency in some way. Your sun is located in the 8th house, which is a somewhat more obscure sounding house in terms of what it rules. It's called the house of other people's money, for one thing. It's also called the house of regeneration and change, the house of death, the house of sexuality. It deals with psychological concepts and all kinds of things that some people find a little bit forbidding. If you have the sun in the 8th house in Taurus, one of the implications that often goes with this is that you are intended to circulate among people who are financially powerful, which means the possibility of working in a bank or an insurance company or a stock brokerage firm. The point is to be involved in handling someone else's resources towards their own betterment is one of the themes of the 8th house sun. But also to develop the ability to help people improve their lives is another 8th house characteristic, such as being the catalyst, in a sense. To give people advice that will serve to inspire them out of a seemingly hopeless situation is also an 8th house characteristic. I guess the key word of an 8th house person is that you have the ability to more profoundly affect people's lives by dealing with them on issues that are somewhat more significant and profound. The 8th house definitely does have a strong link up with sexuality too. People with a lot of energy in the 8th house are normally people who have a strong interest in sexual matters, but they're not usually doing it for fun. It's something they usually take fairly seriously as something that they need to do in order to touch another person's soul. 8th house people tend to make things more complicated a lot of the time. They look for deeper meanings in things than the average person. 8th house has a lot of scorpionic connotations, even though that is the opposite sign of the sign of Taurus here. But you see, in your 8th house, you not only have the sun, but 3 other planets that we call personal planets. The planets that we find tell us more about our own individual characteristics. Like the moon in Aries, for instance. Now, the moon is important too. The moon is your habit patterns and instincts and what you do without thinking here in this life. And women tend to respond rather strongly to their moon signs. If you have a moon in Aries, it's going to give you somewhat more impatient emotions. And combined with Taurus energy will probably make you capable of expressing and experiencing a lot of dynamic energy in life. It's a good combination for a business person. It's not a particularly good combination for someone being asked to play out a submissive role, because Taurus tends to be stubborn and not easily bossed around, particularly not hurried around. And Aries, by nature, is not a sign that likes to be dominated, period. So this means once you develop a particular set of aspirations or a habit pattern, I don't see just anybody being able to come along and sway you from that particular direction. The change will probably come as a result of your own direct efforts. Your chart is much more of an upper hemisphere wheel. That is, more of the planets in the upper half. Upper half people are the people who circulate more in this world and deal more with relationships on all levels. They are not usually intended to be stay-at-home types who sit around washing the dishes and watching television all day. By nature, if you've got a Mars in Aries too, this is going to demand more action in your world. People with Mars in Aries are usually fairly honest and explicit about what they want to do. They go right to the point a lot of the time. And your Mars, like the Sun and Venus, all make these red lines down to Jupiter called squares. And what Jupiter does in a square aspect is it expands and exaggerates further the planets at the other end that are involved here. So anybody who's born with a Mars square Jupiter, for instance, is said to be someone who is especially inclined to be more persistent, more ambitious, more inclined to keep trying to do what they want to do in life instead of just giving up on things. And situated as it is between the 5th and the 8th houses has specific connotations. For one thing, usually both the 5th and 8th house are linked to a person who has a fairly healthy attitude about sex. And in the second place, it's a nice combination for somebody with a lot of creative energy and imagination. Jupiter will give you a lot of clues to your appropriate career. It's the planet of opportunity and expansion. If it is in Aquarius, you will need to be open to being involved in companies or forms of work that are a little unconventional or unusual. Now, a lot of Tauruses are not inclined to want to go around and wearing purple hairdos and acting strange. So we're not talking here about something that's really weird that you'd be doing. But the Silicon Valley is full of Aquarian-type firms promoting products that nobody else has in production, promoting ideas that are ahead of their time. A person with Jupiter in Aquarius is usually drawn to an environment where there's a lot of intelligent people around them, and where there is a greater sense of freedom and equality, for instance, between the sexes, and where people are generally more open to new ideas. So people with Jupiter in Aquarius, and I'm one of them, are usually people who don't like living in a really staid environment, even though they may complain at times that they wish they could have a little more peace. If you have the Sun squaring Jupiter, this also is a very positive aspect. Not all squares are negative. It's an aspect that's constantly going to cause you to question if there isn't a better way of doing things. Your Taurus energy may fight this, but there is a split in your chart. An argument, you might say, between the Aries and Aquarius type energies and the Taurus. Instinctively, the Aries energies are going to say, you want a lot of things right now and you're not going to want to wait for them. And the Taurus is going to jump in and say, hey, wait a minute, we got to work this out on more of a schedule. So either way, though, neither of these placements are going to cause you to walk away from the problem. Taurus by nature is like the person, the carpenter on the roof. It starts raining and he keeps hammering away because that's what he's doing and he's going to finish the job. So if you're a Taurus woman, or a Taurus man for that matter, people are likely to admire you because you're probably not going to seem like someone who's constantly getting distracted by totally ridiculous endeavors. You'll make an unconventional idea seem more practical. So if you have a product that seems exciting, new, and different, you'll still manage to sell it in a rather intelligent fashion, so the more conservative types will not be turned off by you. This is another important planet here. It's Uranus in your house of public standing. 10th house shows you what you're going to be remembered for. People with Uranus in the 10th are remembered for being different, for being original, and often more spontaneous than your average Taurus, for instance. So there is an element of creative energy and innovation that is getting involved in your chart, so that you will not be one of the more staid types of Tauruses that we do find running around. Some Tauruses do exactly the same thing every day for 45 years. But your chart would seem to indicate you're much more of a visionary here, and despite attachments to some comfortable routines, the energies in your chart indicate every now and then there's going to be an insistent push within you to go out and try something experimental, even if it might involve some risk here. So as I say, there's going to be a battle between the somewhat more fiery natures of the Aries energy, the Uranus energy, and then the Taurus energy on the other side. If you have a Virgo rising too, this will influence career choices normally too. Virgo rising people usually need a work niche, something they can do in that they do particularly well in, and they keep rechanneling their energy back into that job. Virgo rising people are very inquisitive. They're always asking questions, and they notice things that are kind of out of sync, like a picture that's crooked on the wall. Virgo rising people sometimes get involved in the medical profession because of their concern about keeping everything in just exactly the right order. The thing is, though, I don't see this medical thing particularly supported by other features of your chart. The 8th house activity that you have, the 5th house activity, suggests that you probably need something It's going to give you a little more room for exploration as well as simply making money. Tauruses do not like being poor. They will marry someone who is wealthy, or they will make it themselves. And even if they're poor as rats, they will still manage to dress in such a way that they look like they have money. This is not a sign that likes an uncomfortable financial position, and normally will not have an empty house that they live in. Tauruses sometimes accumulate too much stuff, as a matter of fact, for the sake of security. Clothes, in particular, are often an old favorite. Sometimes food in the basement. Sometimes the furniture thing. The point is, Taurus likes a lot of things, and they like nice things. They like taste. And they represent taste. And they like men who have taste. Tauruses also hate men who try to push them too quickly into a relationship. Now, a lot of women don't like that, admittedly, but Taurus particularly values men with good manners who lay the foundation properly for the development of the relationship. So, in addition to the Sun and Venus in Taurus, which, by the way, will probably bring you attractive men, and since it's in the 8th house, probably men with money in the long run, you also have Mercury in Taurus, and this is convenient for interpretation, because the more planets you have in the same sign, the fewer contradictions in the chart. Mercury rules perception and communication. People with Mercury in Taurus tend to have a nice speaking voice, and they also tend to want to talk more slowly. They don't like to be hurried too much when it comes to explaining something either. Your Mercury's in the 9th house, however, different from the other two Taurus planets, the house that deals with metaphysical matters. It's the house of the higher mind, higher education, religion, travel. People with Mercury in the 9th are more interested, in other words, in talking about matters of somewhat more evolved interests, you might say. If you've got Mercury in the 9th, you will more likely enjoy the company again of well-educated people. Jupiter in Aquarius is the same thing, which you also have. People with Mercury in the 9th often master another language because they feel like they're missing something in the manner of social interaction by only knowing one, or it comes in handy with their work. If you have Mercury in the 9th, it's rather appropriate for someone who's kind of a teacher, somebody who has something to say that sounds educated and intelligent. And it will probably also cause you to want to read about foreign places too, places you might wish to travel. Now, just as you have 3 planets squaring Jupiter, and I didn't mention one of those, the Venus square Jupiter, which is basically an aspect that indicates continuous capacity for having fun in life, you also have 3 squares to Pluto over in the 11th house. Now, squares to Pluto are a little more heavy-handed. They're rather absolute. None of the squares to Pluto are really that close to being exact, but they're enough within orbs, so they're likely to have some applicability here. An exact square would be like 6 Taurus to 6 Leo, but that's not what you have here. If you got a Sun square Pluto, there are simply some things you won't do, period, which is not very unlike a Taurus. When Tauruses decide they're going to put their foot down or they're going to lie down in the pasture, that's it, and nobody's going to move them until they darn well feel like it. People with Sun-Pluto squares go through periods every now and then where they decide to do something rather abrupt and dramatic to change their lives, even though they have been stubbornly fixed to some pattern for many years. The Sun square Pluto is like a time bomb going off. And it means every now and then you're going to meet some people in your life that you're just going to decide to banish all of a sudden because there's no place else to go with the relationship, and that will be it too. Venus, the planet of love and affection, squares Pluto, which is part of this picture. But you also have Mercury squaring Pluto, and that means in communication, people will at times sense you're making some very direct and absolute judgments on things. Tauruses have a tendency to argue about things no one else would care to argue about, or even find it necessary to argue about, because there's something about Taurus that has just a natural tendency to put the skids on things everybody else thought were just fine to do. At any rate, all of these strong Pluto aspects are the kinds of things that indicate you're going to develop some very distinct likes and dislikes in life, particularly the way men behave around you, for one thing. You will probably do your best to try to pace relationships the way you want them to. Anyway, this question of dictatorialness is probably something that comes out of a past life pattern. Because at the time you were born, Saturn fell in the 12th house in Leo, and that's your house of self-undoing. Everybody has Saturn someplace. But if it's in the 12th house, it has a kind of doubly karmic meaning. Now, the problem with Saturn and Leo, quite simply, is supposedly the person in the previous life made too many absolute decisions and did not share his or her power with others, to the point they may have ended up in some type of downfall. I think Mussolini had Saturn and Leo, if I recall. Now, not everybody ends up being hung by their heels, as he was, who has Saturn and Leo. But the point is, with this position, it basically indicates that in this life you were intended to learn to be somewhat more flexible on some matters, to be able to relinquish your power on occasion, in order that you may grow in other arenas of life. Because too many Tauruses sometimes just keep hanging into something just because that's the way they've been doing things. And yet, all over your chart are strong indications that every now and then you're going to have to make a very abrupt and very non-Taurian change. And if you don't make it, it's going to happen to you anyway. As will probably be the case at this time, as a matter of fact, related to where you're living, but I'll get back into that later. Point is, if you have Saturn in the 12th house, it usually indicates a basic distrust of authority figures, too. And probably the authority figures you will interact with in this life are direct mirrors of what you once were in a previous life yourself. Perhaps not always considerate of the employee's needs, perhaps just plain egocentric. So something about you in this lifetime is intended to develop a somewhat more rebellious spirit, because when you have Uranus in the 10th, it means you're going to be remembered for your originality, and also the probability that you will make changes at times that will catch people very much off guard. Suddenly things will just happen to change your life very, very quickly. People with Uranus in the 10th often have employers that leave abruptly, or you just simply decide to find another one for that matter. Uranus in the 10th does not normally create stable associations with authority figures. There are other symbols in the chart that also relate to karma. The North Node and the South Node, these horseshoe symbols that are directly opposite each other. The South Node that you have in Libra in the 2nd house indicates that in a previous life you probably were someone who tried to set up your own rules as to who you were going to share your money and your wealth with. And you may have been a little too preoccupied with wanting to have your own way with many things. So there's something going on in this life that is going to be relating to being able to renounce having everything stay the same indefinitely. 8th house people periodically find it useful to rid themselves of certain property usually. It serves as a kind of cleansing process. Now, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily burn your house down to do this, but basically an 8th house person is someone who needs to go through an occasional process of going up to the attic and giving things away to the poor or whatever. It seems to serve as a cleansing process that's kind of useful. Nevertheless, I doubt if any Taurus would give everything away, because this is a sign that is not usually inclined to go on a total self-denial type trip. Anyway, in addition to this, you have Neptune in your 1st house. That's there. And Neptune in the 1st is kind of nice because it will add to a general appearance of congeniality. First house deals a lot with appearances. And people with Neptune in the first house can appear quite differently to others in different social settings, kind of like chameleons. They adapt themselves more easily to environments that they enter into. So the one problem I always have with Neptune in the first house people is reading them, because sometimes they seem to be here when they're actually somewhere else. Now, the thing about Neptune in the first house is that when you have this, it's going to make you more psychically attuned, in other words, to what's going on around you, more psychically receptive normally. Since you have such strong Taurus energy, though, I don't see you as one of these, well, might call them airheads. Well, that's not quite right. Airy-fairy people that's got that totally spaced out look on their face. The Neptune in the first house person with a Taurus sun is not likely to look like a space case, but they do have the capacity of knowing how to say the right thing in a particular social situation to put other people at ease. Taurus, along with this other placement, is associated with a good sense of what is socially right and acceptable. So with Neptune in the first house, you really will have the ability to charm the daylights out of people. This placement is rather difficult for someone who is trying to be highly competitive, because it will cause you to be more aware of the feelings of other people who might lose out in a competition with you. But with the Taurus Sun and Moon in Aries, I don't see you just quitting on things just because you feel sorry for somebody else who might lose out in a competitive sense. The point is, it's going to give you a sense of sensitivity here, so that you at least will try to be more considerate towards anyone you feel might be in one of those competitive situations with you. Your Neptune, in other words, is somewhat contradictory to the other part of the chart here. The Neptune in the first house means that the initial response people will have to you is, hey, here's a pretty sympathetic and pleasant person. But as they get to know you, they'll start dealing with the Taurus Sun and the Moon in Aries, and they'll see, here we're dealing with a very reliable and conscientious person who's going to stick to her guns. If you have Neptune in the first house, it is usually associated with people with creative ability, people who have some kind of skill or desire, I should say, to make the world a more beautiful place. The same tends to be true of Jupiter in the fifth. If you have Jupiter in the fifth house, you will likely have an ability towards giving the world a greater sense of fun. This is the house that rules children, for one thing. And people with Jupiter in Aquarius in the fifth tend to relate rather well to the way children think. Some people with Jupiter in Aquarius in the fifth can become, in fact, directly involved in the educational process. But the main thrust of Jupiter in Aquarius in the fifth is that it gives a lot of originality in a creative sense. So any artwork that you did, or any music or whatever, would be something that would allow you to set yourself apart from others if you chose. You do not have one thing in your chart here that says you have to do, well, you have to spend your life being a mule skinner, in other words. There's a lot of options. You have different possible expressions, and I should submit that with Gemini at the midheaven, you may very well be remembered for being involved in two distinctly different professions, and the fact that you would make an overnight change as far as those are concerned at some point. Some people with Gemini up there are involved in two professions at once, but anyway, there is something about you that is ultimately going to cause people to have a very hard time putting you in a box. They will think they've got you figured out, and then they realize there's a little more to you, and there's a little more in life that you're looking for, and that you're not going to just stop once you've accomplished certain goals. Something's going to keep spurring you on to discover more, even though your Taurus side wants things to be comfortable and safe. Maybe your Aries energy, your Jupiter and Aquarius energy are going to say, but hey, maybe there's something more we can keep looking for here. It certainly looks like one thing is pretty obvious. It looks like you're a person who's going to try to have fun here in life. I don't see you as someone who's going to get terribly embroiled in the work ethic to the point that you're going to decide work is everything. Clearly your chart indicates there's something about you which is going to want to lead an interesting life, unlike some Tauruses who like repetition, and that you are a person who's going to look for more profound meanings to what life is all about. Anyway, there is one, or well, there's more than one, but there's one rather striking characteristic in your chart that I haven't mentioned, and that is you have absolutely no planets anywhere in water signs. Nothing in Pisces, nothing in Cancer, nothing in Scorpio. Some people get a rising sign, but you don't even have that in water. Whenever you lack an element, it often has a lot to do with forces that we direct in life. And it operates different ways. There's usually two different ways that happen when you have two different situations that arise when you've got a missing element. One is that you will keep feeling as though you're missing that element, and you will try to compensate for that in some way. Or you'll go one step farther and really embrace it in some sense. So those two distinctions are not really distinctions. They're very much tied together in a sense. So I will tell you what happens usually when people lack water. For one thing, they usually want to take a lot of baths and showers or go in the swimming pool because they want to compensate for the lack of water in their chart through the direct experience of it. Another thing they'll do is get involved with people born with strong water in their charts. And, of course, there is a symbolic meaning to a lack of water. People who lack water are often individuals who are in need of some greater meaning in life. A lot of Tauruses, for instance, get very preoccupied with making money and finding security, and yet they feel like there's something else they must be missing out there. So your chart would indicate, along with many other features, that the Taurus energy for you is not going to be enough. As would be the case in many others, I don't see you being married to repetition. I see you as a person who's going to feel an enduring desire to find something more in the manner of life's meaning and to embrace some creative activity, which is also water energy. Now, oddly enough, Aquarius, the water bearer, is not a water sign. It is an air sign. But having it in the fifth house, in a sense, will make you a person more open to creative expression. That is, the expression of the child within yourself, which is spontaneous. There's also another group of signs you don't have a lot of here, though, and that's the mutable signs. You have only one planet in a mutable sign, which is Uranus in Gemini. People who lack energy in mutable signs often lack a sense of adaptability, which is classically Taurian anyway. If you're a Taurus, you're going to like to make your own rules about things, and I don't see you easily adapting to someone else's rules they're trying to impose upon you. 6 of your planets are in fixed signs, which means just that. There is something about you that's fairly fixed and reliable. And yet, as I say, every now and then, I don't know, it may be years between this, but every now and then there's going to be a major kind of jerk that will get you out of the pattern. I don't mean a person who's a jerk, maybe, but
There have been a lot of those.
Usually most of the women who come in here complain of that. There is something very deficient in the American male stereotypes out there. Archetypal American males. Yes, well, with a Venus square Pluto, I shouldn't expect anything else. Every now and then you're going to reach a brick wall where you can't go any further and you just have to change everything. Your chart is not as easily integrated as some. It's got contradictions in it. And we have to kind of decide how to blend them together here, in other words. Now, in addition to this, you have 2 planets in the chart we call dispositors. These are the planets here, Venus and Mars. And these are the planets you will defer to for much of your decision-making in life. Venus says, I'm going to base my decisions on what I can do next that's going to be enjoyable, what's going to bring me money and bring me nice friends and love and all of that. Not too unusual. Mars says, well, let's do whatever is going to get us there in the most efficient way, where we can express our more aggressive spirit, perhaps. They may not get along, these two planets, all the time. It's basically the Sun in Taurus versus your Moon in Aries that we're talking about here, too. It's a very similar type of polarity. One wants things right now, and the other side of you says, let's do this at the right time. Let's try and make this a little more leisurely and civilized. So there's something in you that's never going to be a quitter, but there could be an argument as to when and where you decide to address change for yourself. Now, by moving to the West Coast, you do have some advantages. The Sun and Venus will fall at the top of the chart for what we call the relocation. Let me clarify what relocation charts are about. The relocation chart that you pick for any given location in the world is where the planets would have been if you had been born there at the same minute you actually were born. It happened that in California at 4:20 p.m., which was really 3:20 p.m. standard time, it was close to lunchtime, which would have put the Sun up at the top of your chart at that point. So that means by moving to the West Coast, you have a much greater chance of achieving great personal success. Now, you can go back to Niagara Falls and still do some things out there, I suppose. But if you want more influence, if you want to rise up to positions of authority, if you want to be noticed, the West Coast is the place for you to be. If you want to meet more successful men, they may not be nicer, but maybe they'll be more successful. You're going to find them more out here on the West Coast, for instance. Physically, people are going to notice you here. It's everything you do is going to achieve greater recognition. At any rate, let me also go around the houses in the order in which they are placed here, because as you may note, some of them are empty, and they do deal with certain subject matters of life. First of all, the first house is your house of self-initiative. And if you have Virgo rising, it means you're basically a person who wants to initiate work and service, and probably will be a person who will be somewhat selective about the words you use and communicate towards others. You'll be more sensitive to people's grammar. Not everyone with Virgo rising becomes involved in the medical profession, but they usually are more cognizant of nutrition and the need to eat the right things and assimilate them together properly. Virgo rising will give you a more sensitive digestive tract, is basically the story there. Virgo rising people ask lots of questions, and a lot of the people around them don't have the answers. Virgo rising people notice things other people don't, which sometimes unnerves others. With Neptune in the first house, there's a sense of idealism here too, though, that will enter your initial reactions to things. With a chart such as yours, I would see you as a person who's going to strive somewhat harder to, well, make life into something more than the average person would, to look for more higher truths, and to be a person who will constantly be trying to improve your life somewhat more. It doesn't look like you're going to do it by stepping on people's faces, but more by just simply persevering in your own way. Neptune in the first house with this indicates that you will be a person who is constantly easily, well, made impressionable by the people you're around. That is, you will more easily soak in what people are not saying as much as what they are saying, usually. Neptune opposes your moon, which is the purple line running across the middle of the chart, and most people with displacement are noted for having a greater amount of psychic awareness as well. The trouble with that aspect is it tends to make a person sometimes aware of psychic impressions while we're trying to wrestle with an account book or something. You'll get more of these feelings at inopportune moments. The second house is your house of money and property. Second house, in your case, is not all that active, but its opposite is, which also deals with financial concerns. The distinction is the second house is your money and the eighth is other people's money, and it does indicate if you get married, and you may already have experienced that, or, okay, in the long run, you'll probably end up inheriting some money here. You would very likely outlive your husband, this wealthy man I'm speaking of, who you should get one of these days here, if you want it, that is. You see, the eighth house is very much linked to matters linked to death, and somehow profiting from it, oddly enough. That is, with all this eighth house energy up there, you could easily become more easily embroiled in matters linked to somebody's inheritance and actually end up with a lot of money. You could also end up in estate planning, for that matter, with a strong eighth house. The point is, eighth house people deal with profound issues in life. Life and death matters, literally. I was going to say something else brilliant about that, but I can't remember where I was. I'll get back around to the eighth again in a minute. But my point is, your financial well-being is likely to be linked to being able to circulate and have connections with other people who are powerful and influential. Once that occurs, various types of momentum can develop for you. Now, you have Libra on your house of money, which indicates you'll have good taste when it comes to property that you own. Neptune is fairly close by. That's someone who often collects artwork, for instance, as an investment as well as a decorative thing. Within the second house, however, is the South Node in Libra, and the trouble with that is you could waste a lot of time in life trying to find absolutely perfect merchandise, trying to get the picture on the wall to be exactly level. Libra energy is often too preoccupied with everything being perfect. So is Virgo rising, for that matter, which you also have. So as I say, there's something about you in this life that was intended to develop a greater amount of flexibility and spontaneity to some extent, but not to the extent of being inconsiderate. You've got some weird karmic statements here that are a little bit contradictory. On the one hand, you've got Saturn in Leo, which says don't allow your ego to get out of bounds. But you also have the North Node in Aries, which says don't get too dependent on anybody either. So apparently in your lifetime, you're especially intended to achieve some kind of balance between not being too dependent on others and also not be too overbearingly egotistical either. Most charts lean somewhat more in one or the other directions, though. The third house is empty, period. And this is the house of communication. It doesn't mean you don't communicate when you have nothing down there. Quite the contrary, Mercury, the planet of communication, is in the house of the higher mind, which is the ninth house, as opposed to the third, which is the lower mind. So you will probably find it somewhat disturbing to have to constantly interact with people who have little intelligence or no ideas. With Scorpio in the third, you'll have an inquisitive mind that wants to look into the deeper side of things, which is something that does show up a lot in your chart. And then we get to your fourth house, which deals with your home and your roots and the end of your life. People with Sagittarius in the fourth are often traveling when they leave this world. That isn't to say you're going to die in a plane crash, but it does mean that you might be on vacation when you experience a natural death or something like that. You might be lying on the beach and, well, anyway, you can think up various variations on that. Point is, this is the sign of travel down here. And people with Sag in the fourth usually have a harder time finding a place they can live in that's permanent. Now here again, we're getting into a contradiction, because Taurus likes permanency, supposedly, but your chart is working against that at the same time. especially now, as I'll get into fairly shortly. If you have Sagittarius on the 4th, it indicates at the base of your being you are a person who really is not going to be comfortable leaving everything the same, and there is something in you that's looking for a better future. The ruling planet of that house is Jupiter in the 5th. That suggests at the end of your life you'll be doing something rather creative and fun from the looks of things. It might involve dealing with children, for that matter, not necessarily your own. See, if you have Jupiter in Aquarius, you will have a greater consciousness to the needs of children at large, the people in the world, children in the world, and their welfare. But it is an empty house, the 4th house, which deals with your domestic concerns, and it does make it more likely that you would have a hard time if you had to stay at home all day here. The 5th house, where you have Jupiter, is the house of creativity, as I mentioned. With Jupiter there in Aquarius, you will probably have a certain number of love affairs that other people might consider a little unusual. Because Aquarius favors things that sometimes relate to significant age differences or some trait on the part of another person that may put them quite in an unusual class. Aquarius is on your house of work, an empty house. This certainly doesn't mean you won't work, but it does mean it's very unlikely you're going to end up in one of those slave-type roles the 6th house is often linked to. Aquarius is on the cusp, which again favors being in an environment with a lot of innovation and educated people. Whether or not the company directly caters to it is another matter, but Aquarius does promote new ideas, innovation, electronics, computers, anything along those lines. So it looks like one of the major themes of your chart here is you are intended to circulate not only with powerful people, but intelligent people, people who have a lot of smarts about them. The ruling planet of your 6th is Uranus in the 10th, which means you will be remembered for doing work that is in the long run rather original and interesting. Pisces is on your 7th house, and the 7th house is empty. This is your house of marriage and partnerships. Now, I have an empty 7th house myself. I've never been married. There are things about the 7th house which will give you clues about marriage and relationships. Certainly doesn't mean you're not supposed to get married if there's nothing in there. But it does mean that apparently you are not intended in this life to emphasize a position where you are subservient or at the mercy of a partner, such as in marriage or business for that matter. With more of your energy shoved up into the 8th house, this has more to do with holding your own in this world and not necessarily being as dependent on somebody else to provide for you. Your moon, being placed as it is right before the sun, indicates that you will probably value your privacy to some extent. People with the moon just before the sun, no matter what signs are involved, tend to need some place they can go in this world where they know they won't be disturbed. I just wanted to throw that in before I forgot. Pisces is the sign on your house of marriage, and many people with Pisces on the 7th do attract some rather sensitive men. Sometimes they attract drunks too. Trouble with Pisces is that it's not always as tangible as we'd like it to be. I would sense that some of the men you're going to attract are going to talk big and not always deliver on their promises. There is something about your chart to indicate attracting some men who are going to be some real BSers, if you don't mind my saying. Got big ideas and, well, they don't always do everything they should in order to fulfill those. But that 8th house is really loaded. You got 4 planets and the North Node. Anytime you have an active house like that, it's really something you have to pay attention to. So let me go through each one of the planets there in a little more detail. First of all, the moon shows what you worry about in life too. If it's in Aries in the 8th, you could get very anxious and concerned about money that was due you that didn't arrive when it was supposed to. Moon in Aries in the 8th produces a lot of impatience about paychecks that don't come when they're supposed to, for instance. People with the Moon in Aries tend to worry more actively about themselves in many respects. Did they do the right thing at the right time? If you have a Moon in Aries, it's very hard to remain calm emotionally because this constantly tends to churn up the emotions somewhat more. And a person with the Moon in Aries in the 8th house usually is not that calm about sexual matters. It can charge them up a great deal, and it can also make them quite angry if they don't get what they want. So sex is likely to be a fairly sensitive issue with all of this 8th house stuff. You also have Mars in the 8th house, and Mars is the planet of war and aggression. It's in your 8th house, and you feel like you're not getting, again, your fair share of the money that's circulating in the world. I see you as a person who's not going to just take that lying down. People with Mars in the 8th do sometimes leave this world through or during travel, or while being in some mode of transportation, I'll admit. If you have Mars in the 8th house, it's going to cause you to want to occasionally cut through a lot of red tape in a great hurry. The Sun in Taurus in the 8th, along with Venus, is just plain sensually, usually sexually attractive energy. But it also has to do with, well, let me see if I can phrase this properly. If you have this particular combination in your 8th house, it indicates you're going to be drawn to people who have a lot of magnetism to their name. I don't see you liking superficial people with that placement. Some Taurus women marry men who are carpenters. You see, the Taurus energy that you suppress will in some cases be projected through the men you attract. But in your case, you need something a little more sophisticated, presumably. Anyway, let's see, I talked about the 9th and the 10th. The 11th has Pluto in it. Pluto in the 11th is associated with people who usually have to go through a period every now and then of banishing a whole set of people in their lives, not just one at a time, but like a whole group of friends they're bored with. Or it's the other way around. They decide you're unfit for public consumption. They decide that you're not measuring up to the stuffy country club standards they've set or something like that, and suddenly they're not talking with you. Pluto creates some very absolute changes in the social situation, social sphere. It will draw you to, again, influential people, but also there are these periods of just absolute change where you just start over again with a totally new group of people, in other words. Your 12th house has Saturn in it, which I mentioned, and people with Saturn in the 12th also are supposed to be guarding against being too dogmatic in this lifetime, being too conservative, being too stuffy, taking themselves too seriously. That's a no-no. But you also have something else in the 12th house, that circle with the X in the middle, which is called the part of fortune. And that's a line of least resistance, and it means that being more psychically aware is something that will probably come more naturally to you in many respects. Oddly enough, the 8th house has some strong metaphysical connotations to it too. People who have really vivid types of dreams are often people with strong 8th house energies. People who are unwittingly involved in some of the more mysterious, even frightening types of psychic phenomena are often 8th house people. With these placements, it will be, if you ever decide you want to open a door like that, you're likely to have more intense experiences on the psychic level. The 8th house is strongly linked to people with more of an interest in psychological matters, knowing the meaning of the soul and all of that kind of thing. So you're a Taurus with depth. There are a lot of Tauruses in this world that are very boring, as a matter of fact, because they are so involved in repetition. But your chart says you got contradictions, for one thing. People are not going to say, well, we've got Elizabeth in a box and she's just going to stay there. Because there are a lot of elements in here that say periodically you're just going to decide you're not going to do things exactly the way they think you are, And you really have a capacity to keep people in a position where they'll be guessing about you somewhat. Now, I don't think they're going to say, oh gosh, that person's weird, let's stay away from her. But I do think they're going to have a hard time putting you in one box. At any rate, if you look down the page here, there are a few other items. 7 planets in the so-called positive signs, which are the fire and air energies. These are the more aggressive energies, and will make it less likely that you would be able to accept a subservient, passive role in life. Saturn's in detriment in Leo because, well, basically Saturn is a planet that's in conflict with many of the energies of Leo. But Saturn gives you problems no matter where it is, so it doesn't really matter if it's in Leo any more than another sign. In addition to this, you have 6 planets in succeedent houses. Now, that usually means someone who's not going to be a wallflower, but it also indicates you probably also won't be as actively seeking public attention, except by being on the West Coast. That picture changes somewhat. If you want a more obscure type of reputation, by all means go back to Niagara Falls or someplace like that. But if you want to make a name for yourself and you want to meet more prominent people, the West Coast is a better place for you to be. California is a Virgo state, supposedly, although I never thought that fit very well. Virgo energy goes rather well with your chart in many respects. Now, in addition to this, your rising planet is Neptune, which means the intuitive side of your nature is constantly going to influence your reactions, so you won't be totally prone to operate from a purely mental point of view. You have somewhat more of an influence in the fire and earth signs. The fire signs are associated with an enthusiasm for life, having fun, showing we're just as good as the next person, and the earth signs are the good workers, the people who are rather resourceful and able to use their property to their advantage. So together you've got a nice set of planets for being a working person and being a professional and being able to get somewhere and leave your mark in this world. You do have a good many squares, but this isn't really negative. The combination of squares, especially from Pluto and Jupiter, are simply a driving force towards causing you to not settle for second best or a mediocre existence. The Taurus energy is stubborn, but that can be stubborn in your desire to pursue a particular goal until you achieve it on your own time. Okay, now the retrogrades are not a big deal in your chart, particularly Neptune, which is retrograde half the year, but Saturn retrograde does make it harder sometimes to find authority figures that we can get good advice from. Especially when you have Saturn in the 12th, it means in a previous life you may have been somewhat moralistic in a way that caused people to look at you as though you were intimidating them a bit, I suppose. So something about you in this lifetime is intended to loosen up and not take yourself too seriously, apparently, especially with Jupiter in the 5th house, which you have. The only planet in the lower half of the chart which is not retrograde is Jupiter, and the lower half has to do with our ability to get in touch with our deeper nature, our inner self. So if you can find a really unique creative outlet, and I don't mean something just ordinary like making pottery or something like that, but to do something that's really original and different, and this is somehow going to allow you to connect with the deepest part of your being. Same with Mercury in the 9th house. To master another language will also probably open some doors to you that otherwise would not be present. Okay. I'll look at my notes here and see if there was something else. I guess I don't see too many other themes about the natal chart. Do you have anything you want to ask about the natal before we get into the things that are coming up for you?
Yeah, when you were talking about the money,
Yes.
there's mine and there's everybody else's.
Yes.
Is there necessarily any romantic involvement in that, or could that be parental? I mean, could that just mean that I'm going to inherit money from my father?
Yes, I'm very glad you brought that up. Because yes, the sun in a woman's chart also tends to relate to father figures too. You've got actually 4 symbols in there that represent different types of characters. The moon is women. Mars is, it could be like an athlete, I suppose. Sun could be any man. Venus could be friends. So you have the capacity here actually to inherit money from various sources if the circumstances fit. The only thing I'm a little bit concerned about is the symbols in the chart related to your father, like Saturn and Uranus, indicate he may very well unwittingly do things in that respect at inopportune moments. That is, you may wish he would have done certain things for you at some other point in which it would have been more advantageous. People with Saturn in the 12th do not always trust father because it seems like he's doing something that's counterproductive to their own efforts. Okay, do you have another?
No.
Okay. All right, let's get into the subject of what I see coming up for you. And let's talk about, first of all, this Uranus transit in your 4th house, because I know that relates to the first question you had with your place of residence. Now, the transit that Uranus is currently making in your chart is a once-in-a-lifetime shot. I haven't yet had Uranus in my 4th, and I won't have it probably till the end of the century. It's a very significant aspect. You see, Uranus rules spontaneous change and accelerated change. When it hits the 4th house cusp, which is where it is this year, as well as I think next year, the potential for changing residences is quite strong, even if the person is doing everything they can to avoid it. The summer of 87, it's fairly strong, but it's even stronger this year. And there are particular times in which this planet would more likely operate towards causing you to have to make a move. One of these will be, for instance, in September, when both Jupiter and Uranus are in alignment with each other. Another time might be the month of February, but I don't want to just leave it as being only those 2 months. The point is, Uranus is just sort of sitting down there, and it's likely to make you kind of restless. Now, I must admit, I had a client, a friend of mine. She was living in this house in Palo Alto a number of years ago, and I saw that transit approaching down there, and she said, "No, absolutely not. I'm not going to move. I want to live here forever." Well, it so happened that the owner of the house that she lived in, which was a very old house in Palo Alto, decided it would be far more profitable to tear it down and put in condominiums, which she did. So as a result of this, my friend was forced to move in fairly short order. So if you get Uranus in the 4th, you have to be prepared for these little unpredictable items. However, if you're open to change, you want to make the change, it makes it a lot easier to handle this aspect than if you don't want it, because it'll probably happen anyway. The trouble with Uranus hitting the 4th is some people, they get a mudslide coming in their living room window under that one sometimes. It has to do with the unexpected occurring, which causes us to have to make a sudden shift. Uranus in the 4th, at a minimum, will usually cause people to want to remodel, but it's usually something much more important, like an uprooting that actually occurs. Now, you don't have to move to Siberia under this aspect, but it is highly probable that some type of residential change would be occurring, particularly in a year such as this. But there's a psychological ramification to the 4th house, too. People with Uranus on the 4th often also experience a need to start building some new foundation for themselves. through the development of some interest that is often rather unconventional and different. And this can be linked in some way to where they move to, for that matter. It also relates to the parents. When Uranus hits the 4th house cusp, suddenly things happen to one's parents. It is a possibility, I won't say a probability, but it's a possibility something might happen to one of your parents this year, which very much alters their lifestyle. It is the kind of aspect which can create some real shakeups in a home environment and family situations. Now, that's not the only aspect that is encouraging change for you this year. We have another one that is extremely important too, and this is Pluto in Scorpio, opposing your Sun and Venus in Taurus, and that also is a once-in-a-lifetime shot. Both Uranus and Pluto are associated with transformations we often feel we do not have a lot of control over. When you have Pluto opposing the Sun and Venus, it can create some real problems about being married, for instance, or being in a permanent relationship, a so-called permanent relationship, because under this aspect, often things do change. They have to change. We find we simply cannot deal with some of the people we are in partnership with as a result of that aspect. It's kind of like discovering Mr. Hyde after you thought you knew Dr. Jekyll real well. This would be a time in your life in which you will probably experience some men. You don't have to be married to them necessarily, but you will probably see more in the manner of men, in qualities in men that you don't like. And yet there's something coming in right now that is also a beneficial influence to your relationships. What I'm saying is, right now, Jupiter, the planet of expansion and opportunity, is entering your house of marriage. It's going to be hanging around this area of the chart into the beginning of next year. So what I'm saying is, we've got kind of a revolving door thing going here. This is a very likely year for you to purge your life of certain people, especially men you can't stand anymore. But also, it looks like a very likely year for some new ones to come in, the likes of which you've not experienced before and who will be very supportive to you. But it will be hard to maintain the status quo in this year, and I wouldn't be surprised if in a year such as this, you might find that one of the men that you know actually experiences a demise, because Pluto can create that type of absolute change too. Pluto deals not with just, say, the physical death of certain people, but psychological deaths. I think this is far more pertinent to what we're dealing with in your chart this year. This is a year in which you are intended to be able to renounce those Taurian habit patterns in favor of other things that will bring you growth. And this means this is a year you're intended to move and presumably find and develop new relationships. And the decisions that you make in reference to either of those categories will have rather lasting consequences. Now, maybe I'm getting a little too dramatic about this year, because actually I'm going to have to admit both 87 and 88 have tremendously important aspects for you too. Especially 88 when Jupiter is finally in Taurus. That will be a significant year of benefit for you. If you're waiting to collect on some money, for instance, you may not even have to wait for 88 for that. You'll get Jupiter in your house of other people's money next spring, 87, which can help to accelerate along the recipiency of money. Tauruses have not had absolutely wondrous aspects in the 80s. Saturn was in Scorpio 82 to 85. This caused a lot of breakups of relationships for many Tauruses. Right now we have Pluto in Scorpio, which means a lot of Tauruses are feeling like they're dealing with some rather rigid and unyielding people that they simply have to get rid of in this world. So, do you see, when we get to 88, Jupiter, the planet of opportunity, is going to be in your sun sign, and that means a lot of things will be falling into place in your life. I would expect you'd have more money then. I would expect career-wise you're going to find it easier to make changes. If you're looking for a new relationship, it will be easier to find then also. And you'll probably be a lot healthier. 88's an important point of stabilization for many Tauruses, where they're going to feel like they kind of arrived someplace where they finally feel like they've got a lot more certainty in their world. But there's something I need to elaborate on that is linked to the move, because you actually got two stages of things going on here. This is a year you could easily change residence all of a sudden and feel like you have no control over it. The trouble is, next year Saturn enters your 4th house. And Saturn is fix the roof time and raise the rent time, only you're not raising the rent, somebody else is. You get Saturn sitting right on the cusp of your 4th house in March and April of 87, and it returns again in November and December of 87. These are times in which you could indeed experience a crisis related to where you live. In the manner of additional expenditures is a probability, and perhaps the necessity to do something more conservative or practical in reference to where you're living. Saturn on the 4th can also again relate to a parental influence, possibly ill health for a parent, or just simply them making demands on you that you feel are excessive. Responsibilities being placed upon you by a parent is one of those aspects. Sometimes it involves having someone move in with us that we feel is a burden. So I'm going to have to say this year and next is a time in which if you're looking for a lot of security where you live, you're probably going to find that's harder to attain. But on the other hand, there's plenty of room for change anyway. The thing about Uranus this year is that it is intended to cause you to shake up your own life from a rather deep level. So don't be surprised if this year, for instance, you experience more intense dreams or a sensation that something really different's going on inside of you. Pluto in particular is a planet that tends to stir up things within us, make us aware of suppressed sexual urges, desires for food we're allergic to. It kind of creates these needs to do things that we keep trying to suppress, but we know we have to do something with. So you have a choice here, and this also applies to next year too. You can either fight the changes or you can try to go along with them somewhat better. But it does look like it's going to be difficult for you to maintain the status quo in a year such as this. Pluto right now is in your house of money and property, which means this is a year in which at one time you could feel very rich and the next minute you feel like you've suddenly had to pay out all your money in some kind of glob. Pluto tends to create situations where we do things with melodramatic gestures, and it is influencing the houses of money here in your chart at this time. Now you were interested, for instance, in a change in employers that you were planning to implement yourself, I gather?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm implementing all of the changes.
Okay. Well, good. I like that better, because otherwise they would be not under your control as much if you resisted doing it. You are right now moving in to what they don't always diplomatically state as the midlife crisis. It's a time in which a lot of things don't seem to be working quite as well, and people feel more in transition. So I'm going to have to admit, 86 and 87 are somewhat intended for your personal experimentation, to try things out that may not in fact work, but will at least allow you to grow away from trends that are now outdated for you. When we get to 88, I think you're going to feel like you've really found yourself and that you're doing something that you really like. But between now and then, it is certainly conceivable you're going to feel like you're not as settled as you want to be. There is certainly the potential for supportive people coming into your life, but there are also these rather insistent planets that say you have to go all the way with the changes that need to be made here, and you can't go halfway on them. Saturn is normally the planet that causes more problems. It really has a somewhat more limited influence at this time. One of the things that it indicates for about the next 4 months or so, would be a time you might have some problems getting financial cooperation of certain people, like if you were looking for a loan. We have particularly messy aspects coming up here in July. July, we have Mercury retrograde, which is the classic planet for producing communication foul-ups, and from everything I'm noticing this week, it's already begun. Even though this planet starts going backwards in reference to the Earth, July 9th, usually the effects of this retrograde arise somewhere between 1 to 3 weeks early. This week, it has required 3 phone calls to accomplish what ordinarily can be done in 1. And this has just been the trend all week for me, which is a sure sign that Mercury is slowing down. So I would have to advise you in this way. If you are wanting to make an easy change in things, July is not a very good time to be doing it. There will actually be 3 days, the 12th to the 14th of July, in which we have 7 planets retrograde. That means you're trying to swim up Niagara Falls, to use an appropriate metaphor here. It's going to feel like you have to really exert unusual effort to accomplish rather boring or basically conventional tasks. So the rule is, whenever Mercury is retrograde, and this happens every 4 months, there's only certain things you can do successfully then. And they're not very good things. Not very useful things. One is you can meditate. Another is you can reread an old book. Or re-experience something from your past, hopefully, that you like. Not everybody finds it something that they like. Instead, they have an old argument come up again with somebody. All retrogrades have to do either with going within or going backwards, literally. And naturally, you don't want to be starting a new job when Mercury is retrograde, if you can help it. It's not that it's absolutely doomed, it just tends to get off the ground on the wrong foot, so people often don't stay in those jobs as long as they think they will. What's more, right now Mars is retrograde too, and that started June 8th and extends through August 12th. When Mars is retrograde, there is a motivational thing that gets in the way of being able to make changes. We don't feel quite as self-confident about what we thought we wanted. So as this gets mixed in with Mercury retrograde in July and the 5 others, it's really going to make people feel very muddled in many respects. Mercury and Mars retrograde are terrible for buying a new car. They're not very helpful if you're having your first sex with a particular person. They tend to cause foul-ups in the physical world, in other words. However, to answer what is probably going on in your mind here, a better period will come in August, in some respects at least, when we get fewer of these retrogrades. Now, what you've got here is something that is a little complicated. The moon in your progressive chart, which is another set of planets I use for determining what's coming up for you, is conjuncting natal and progressed Saturn. That will be August and September. When you get this aspect, there's a tendency to worry a lot more. And therefore, you're probably already going to start feeling this now, especially with the retrogrades, which always diminish people's confidence anyway. So I'm going to have to admit, basically you've got a summer coming up where it's going to be harder to be as upbeat as you would like to be, although some improvement will likely arise in August. Realistically, I will have to admit the better things for you are somewhere farther down the line, particularly in 1987. In 1987, Jupiter goes in Aries. It will hit your moon, I believe, probably May. Let me make sure I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, May of 87, Jupiter hits the moon. That's usually emotional and, in your case, probably greater financial security. And the presence of a woman in your life who is going to be supportive to you in some sense. In addition to that, in your progressed chart, there is a conjunction between the Sun and Mercury in May of 87, indicating some significant connection being made in your life, perhaps in an educational sense, that ends up being quite useful to you. It could just mean you meet a well-educated man at that time, And it may be someone that you met years ago who left and then came back, or something like that. So I wouldn't rule out it having romantic connotations, but it is very much associated with mental and educational rapport. So something in May of 87 looks fairly nice here, and that is the beginning of a basically continuous period that goes into 88, in which this cluster of planets is set off one after another by Jupiter, the planet of opportunity. So in 87, I would think things are going to be falling into place for you somewhat better, but there is one little monkey wrench in the work in 87, and that's Saturn is squaring the ascendant, which means there may be something about your living arrangement or your family that is distracting you from other things you would like to be embracing more actively then. Saturn squaring the ascendant sometimes means we just don't like where we're living. So don't be surprised if you have to make more than one move here in the next couple of years, I'm afraid. Saturn square the ascendant does something else. That's starting, I believe, in January? No. It's more like March of 87. Then it actually backs off. March, April of 87, there's a lot of self-questioning going on in your life. But since Jupiter's on the moon, too, in this general time frame, it's a little bit after that, isn't it? Yeah, it may. Okay. Well, let's say March and April looks like a time in which you're going through a lot of deep self-questioning. Let's just say that first of all. But then it's followed by these better transits coming in, which are going to give you a greater amount of security and happiness. The self-questioning that I see in March and April may have to do with making a significant career choice at that point, which you know involves a lot of work, but eventually will lead to greater benefits for you. So 87, in a sense, has a little more happening in it, and certainly 88 has plenty cooking in it, too. In 1988, you've got Jupiter hitting your Sun. This will be about April, and it will be particularly strong through that summer. And following that period,